What if a man who possessed everything money could buy lived as a prisoner inside his own mansion, shackled not by chains but by memories he refused to bury? And what if the one person capable of unlocking the prison doors was the very woman he was forbidden to love, a bright-spirited housekeeper unknowingly connected to the darkest tragedy of his past? Some say wealth builds castles. But sometimes, it builds cages. And this is the story of a billionaire who lived behind iron gates, and the woman who dared to walk through them with sunlight in her hands. On a windswept cliff overlooking a churning gray sea, Blackwood Manor has stood for centuries, a Gothic silhouette of jagged spires and gargoyles that look like they're weeping when it rains. And inside its walls lived another man made of stone. Alistair Blackstone was the heir to a billion-dollar tech empire, but his name was just a whisper in the financial world, a ghost on the stock market. He hadn't been seen outside the iron gates of his estate in 10 years. For Alistair, the world wasn't a place of opportunity, it was a graveyard of memories. His fortune was a monument to loss, every dollar a reminder of the family he couldn't save. His life was a loop, meticulously controlled. Sunrises were for market reports in his cavernous study. Afternoons were for pacing the West Gallery, with the portraits of his ancestors watching in silent judgment. Sunsets were for staring at the angry sea, letting the roar of the waves drown out the roar in his own head. His home was both his sanctuary and his prison. The polished floors reflected a perpetual twilight, and the silence was a living, oppressive thing, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock, counting down the seconds of Alistair's self-imposed exile. He was a man haunted by betrayal. A shadow from his parents' generation had ripped his world apart, leaving him with a fortune built on ashes and a heart encased in ice. Staff came and went, intimidated by the silence and unnerved by the cold orders delivered through his estate manager. They were scared of him. They saw a monster in the master of the house, a brooding figure glimpsed in a dimly lit corridor. They didn't see the tormented soul trapped inside the gilded cage, a man who believed solitude was his punishment. The world had taken everything from him once, and he'd sworn he would never let it get close enough to hurt him again. Nearly 200 miles away, inside a modest apartment above a struggling laundromat in Brighton, Sarah Macquez folded clothes into a battered floral suitcase. The air smelled faintly of lavender detergent and aged paperback novels stacked across every available surface. The small apartment carried warmth despite its peeling wallpaper and flickering kitchen light. Sarah paused, holding a photograph between her fingers. It showed her and her grandmother sitting on a sunlit park bench, both laughing uncontrollably while pigeons swarmed around their feet. Her grandmother's silver hair glowed in the sunlight, her wrinkled face alive with joy. The woman in the photograph was now confined to a hospital bed, her lungs slowly failing. Medical bills littered Sarah's kitchen table like threatening letters from fate itself. She worked double shifts at a seaside diner, balancing trays of greasy breakfasts while memorizing customer orders with cheerful efficiency. But overtime wasn't enough anymore. The diagnosis had changed everything. Her grandmother needed long-term specialized respiratory care, treatment Sarah could never afford on waitressing tips. Then came the job listing. Live-in housekeeper, Blackwood Manor. Salary, confidential, extremely competitive. Sarah had stared at the listing for nearly 20 minutes, convinced it was either fake or cursed. Everyone in Brighton knew about Blackwood Manor. It was a local legend. The recluse billionaire who hadn't stepped outside his gates in years. The haunted Gothic mansion on the cliffs. The staff who rarely stayed longer than 2 months. Sarah should have been terrified. Instead, she felt hopeful. Because desperation had taught her something powerful, fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. She zipped her suitcase closed and glanced toward the bedroom doorway where her grandmother slept beneath humming oxygen machines. "I'm going to fix this," Sarah whispered to herself. Her grandmother stirred weakly. "You already have, sweetheart," she murmured, eyes half open. "You've kept me alive this long." Sarah forced a smile that trembled at the edges. "I'm about to do better." 2 days later, Sarah stood before the towering iron gates of Blackwood Manor. The sky above the estate was bruised purple with incoming storm clouds. Wind tugged at her brown curls, whipping strands across her face as she gripped her suitcase handle. The gates groaned open slowly, as if reluctant to welcome outsiders. The manor revealed itself piece by piece as her taxi drove up the winding gravel road. Black ivy climbed the stone exterior like veins spreading across an ancient heart. Massive stained glass windows reflected storm light in fractured colors, creating the illusion that the house itself was breathing. Sarah leaned forward, mesmerized. Most people saw something frightening. She saw forgotten beauty. The craftsmanship carved into every stone arch fascinated her. Weathered statues guarded the courtyard fountain, cracked yet proud. The overgrown garden surrounding the property shimmered with wildflowers pushing stubbornly through tangled hedges. "This place isn't dead," she murmured quietly. "It's just lonely." The taxi driver shot her a confused glance in the rearview mirror but said nothing. The manor doors opened before she could knock. Mrs. Eleanor Gable stood inside, posture rigid enough to rival the stone pillars framing the entrance. Her silver hair was styled into a severe bun, and her sharp eyes assessed Sarah with quiet authority. "Miss Macquez," she said flatly. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied brightly, offering a polite handshake that Mrs. Gable ignored entirely. "Follow me." The interior of Blackwood Manor felt like stepping into another century. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen constellations, their lights dimmed to a perpetual twilight. Marble floors reflected every movement with ghost-like clarity. The air smelled faintly of antique wood polish and rain-damp stone. Mrs. Gable walked briskly, her heels clicking with military precision. "You will have access to the kitchen, staff quarters, and main floor," she said. "The west wing is strictly forbidden. You will never enter it. You will likely never see Mr. Blackstone. He values silence above all else." Sarah nodded obediently. "You are here to maintain the house exactly as it exists. No rearranging. No redecorating. No unnecessary noise. You are to be invisible." They stopped beside a decorative table where a vase of wilted white lilies drooped lifelessly. Sarah studied them thoughtfully. "Does invisible include replacing flowers?" she asked gently. Mrs. Gable blinked once, the first crack in her impenetrable composure. "They are replaced weekly by contracted florists. They look sad," Sarah said softly, brushing a fingertip against one browning petal. "The gardens outside look full of life. It might be nice to bring some of that indoors." Mrs. Gable stared at her as though trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, she turned and resumed walking. "Your duties remain as assigned." She never said yes. But she never said no either. Sarah smiled to herself. Because sometimes hope didn't need permission. Sarah's quarters were located in a quieter wing of the manor, far from the grandeur of the main halls. The room itself was modest but surprisingly comfortable, cream walls, antique oak furniture, and a tall window overlooking the overgrown garden sprawling behind the estate. Dust motes floated lazily in sunbeams that fought through heavy gray clouds outside. Sarah placed her suitcase on the bed and slowly turned in a circle, absorbing her surroundings. For a house that felt frozen in time, her room carried a strange softness. It felt like the last place in Blackwood Manor that still remembered warmth. She walked to the window and pressed her palm lightly against the glass. Beyond it, the greenhouse stood in quiet abandonment, its shattered glass panels catching dull reflections of the sky. Ivy strangled the frame, creeping like vines reclaiming forgotten territory. Something about it tugged at her heart. "Maybe we can both breathe again," she whispered absent-mindedly. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway again, holding a neatly folded uniform, black skirt, ivory blouse, and tailored apron. "Dinner preparation begins at 5. The chef has retired for the evening. Mr. Blackstone prefers meals prepared fresh by live staff." "Understood," Sarah replied brightly. Mrs. Gable hesitated before leaving. You may find the atmosphere challenging. Sarah tilted her head. I've worked double shifts at a diner during tourist season, she said with a grin. I once handled a bachelorette party and a kitchen fire at the same time. I think I'll survive. Mrs. Gable studied her for a moment longer before quietly closing the door. For 3 days, Sarah became exactly what Mrs. Gable instructed. A ghost. She learned the manor's rhythm quickly. Which hallway echoed footsteps? Which doors groaned despite oiling? Which chandeliers flickered during storms? Silence ruled the estate with oppressive authority, but Sarah discovered she could still carve small pockets of life into it without breaking the rules. She polished antique silver until she could see her reflection smiling back. She dusted shelves lined with centuries-old novels, whispering apologies to them for years of neglect. She memorized the kitchen's complex layout and surprised herself by cooking meals far more elegant than anything she'd served at the diner. Each morning, she placed fresh flowers in common areas, subtle enough to avoid direct defiance but vibrant enough to shift the atmosphere slightly. She never entered the West Wing. But she often found herself glancing toward it. Meanwhile, from the security monitors hidden inside his private study, Alistair observed everything. He told himself it was routine protocol. Every new employee underwent observation for efficiency and compliance. That was the excuse. The truth was far less rational. He noticed how she moved through the halls like she belonged there. Not timid. Not arrogant. Just, natural. She hummed under her breath occasionally while cleaning, barely audible but unmistakably warm. He should have terminated her contract immediately. Instead, he turned up the audio feed slightly. He didn't understand why. Perhaps because it had been years since he'd heard a sound inside Blackwood Manor that didn't resemble obligation. Still, irritation simmered beneath his curiosity. This house functioned because it remained untouched, predictable and controlled. And she was unpredictable. It happened on the 4th day. Sarah had been assigned to deep clean the 2-story library, a room so massive it felt more like a cathedral dedicated to knowledge than a simple reading space. Towering bookshelves stretched upward toward vaulted ceilings painted with faded Renaissance constellations. Dust clung to the upper shelves like a stubborn memory, untouched for decades. Sarah wheeled the tall rolling ladder across the polished hardwood floor, carefully climbing upward to reach a row of leather-bound classics. The library's silence was heavier than usual that afternoon. It pressed against her ears until it felt unnatural. So without thinking, she hummed. A soft, wordless melody her grandmother used to sing while gardening. The tune floated gently between shelves, weaving through forgotten books and sunlit dust particles dancing in lazy spirals. Sarah lost herself in the rhythm of cleaning, her movements syncing with the melody like instinct. She never heard the door open. Never heard footsteps glide across the thick Persian rug near the entrance. She only realized she wasn't alone when a voice cut through the air like shattered glass. What is that noise? The sound froze her spine. Sarah gasped and spun around too quickly, nearly losing her balance on the ladder. Standing below her was the man himself. Alistair Blackstone. In person, he was far more imposing than any rumor described. Tall. Broad-shouldered. His presence filled the massive library like gravity bending the atmosphere around him. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater and tailored slacks, yet he carried himself with an authority that felt almost ancient. His black hair fell slightly across his forehead, and his storm-gray eyes locked onto her with unsettling intensity. They weren't angry. They were calculating. Wounded. And impossibly tired. I asked you a question, he said again, voice low and rough, like a muscle unused for years. The noise. Stop it. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. She had imagined this moment countless times but never like this, standing above him, clutching a feather duster like a ridiculous weapon. I'm sorry, sir, she managed, climbing down slowly. I was humming. I didn't realize it carried that far. His jaw tightened. This house is designed for silence. Yes, sir. Mrs. Gable explained. Their eyes met fully for the first time. Sarah felt something unexpected twist inside her chest. He wasn't terrifying. He was broken. It's just, she said cautiously, surprising herself with her own boldness, it's a very quiet house. Sometimes a little too quiet. It feels lonely. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Alistair stared at her as if she had spoken an entirely foreign language. Your job, he said slowly, dangerously calm, is to clean my home. Not evaluate its emotional stability. I understand, she replied gently. Her lack of fear unsettled him more than defiance ever could. Most employees avoided eye contact. Some trembled. One previous housekeeper fainted during their first meeting. This woman simply stood there, studying him with unsettling compassion. See that it doesn't happen again, he ordered finally. Without waiting for her response, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Sarah remained frozen for several seconds after he disappeared. Then she exhaled shakily. Okay, she whispered to herself. That went, moderately terrible. But beneath her lingering anxiety, curiosity sparked. Because for a brief moment, when she mentioned loneliness, she could have sworn she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Back in his study, Alistair poured himself a glass of whiskey he had no intention of drinking. His reflection stared back at him through the dark amber liquid. Lonely. The word echoed relentlessly inside his mind. How dare she? How dare someone who had spent 4 days inside his world presume to understand the emotional architecture of his solitude? And yet, she wasn't wrong. He set the glass down untouched. Her voice replayed in his memory, soft, warm, unafraid. It lingered in the sterile quiet of his study like a melody refusing to fade. He hated it. Which meant he couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, Alistair sat at his usual breakfast table inside the West Wing dining chamber. The long ebony table was designed to seat 20 guests. He always sat alone at the head. A silver tray rested before him, perfectly plated eggs, fresh toast, black coffee prepared to exact temperature specifications. Routine, predictable and safe. He lifted the coffee cup absently. Then paused. Beside his plate sat a tiny glass bud vase. Inside it rested a single crimson rose. Fresh, vibrant and alive. Alistair stared at it as if it were an explosive device. His first instinct was immediate fury. This violated protocol. The staff was explicitly forbidden from altering his environment without approval. His hand lifted slowly, prepared to remove it. But the color stopped him. The deep red petals contrasted violently against the sterile white porcelain plate and polished black table surface. It was beautiful. Annoyingly so. He left it there. Meanwhile, Sarah wiped down the kitchen counters nervously, fully expecting Mrs. Gable to appear any second with termination papers. When no confrontation came, she cautiously allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. Upstairs, Alistair drank his coffee while pretending not to notice the rose sitting beside him. He told himself it meant nothing. But when he finished breakfast, he placed the flower gently beside the window instead of throwing it away. And neither of them realized it yet. But something inside Blackwood Manor had just begun to change. The crimson rose became the beginning of a quiet rebellion. The following morning, Alistair entered the dining chamber with his usual mechanical composure. His footsteps echoed with practiced precision across marble flooring, his expression carefully carved into indifference. Yet before he even sat down, his gaze shifted automatically toward the breakfast tray. A pale gardenia rested in the small bud vase. The scent reached him before he could stop himself from noticing, soft, delicate, carrying faint memories of warm summer evenings from a lifetime ago. He frowned. This was unacceptable, unnecessary, and dangerous. He ate his breakfast without touching the flower, but he didn't order its removal either. By the third morning, the flower changed again. Lavender. The scent triggered something buried deep inside him, a fragment of memory he had locked away decades earlier. His mother kneeling in the manor gardens, her gloved hands brushing lavender stalks as she laughed softly while reading poetry aloud. He placed his fork down abruptly. His chest tightened. He should fire her. Instead, he found himself waiting each morning to see what flower would appear next. Sarah never mentioned the flowers. She simply rotated them carefully, selecting blooms from the neglected gardens behind the manor. During her free hours, she began exploring the grounds more thoroughly. That was how she discovered the greenhouse. It stood near the far edge of the estate, half hidden behind overgrown hedges and skeletal rose trellises. Several glass panels were shattered, allowing rain and wind to invade freely. Rust coated the metal framework, and abandoned gardening tools lay scattered across cracked stone flooring. Most people would have seen decay. Sarah saw potential. She pushed open the warped greenhouse door, coughing slightly as dust and stale air swirled around her. Dead vines tangled across worktables, but beneath the debris, she noticed something remarkable. Small green sprouts. Tiny stubborn shoots forcing their way through neglected soil beds. She crouched slowly, brushing dirt aside carefully with her fingertips. Life was still fighting to survive here. Okay, she murmured softly, as if negotiating with the plants themselves. Let's fix this together. Over the following days, she worked in secret. She swept broken glass, repaired soil beds, salvaged irrigation pipes, and hauled buckets of fresh compost from the estate storage sheds. Her hands developed calluses. Her apron gathered permanent dirt stains. But every new sprout felt like a victory. From the observatory window overlooking the gardens, Alistair noticed movement one afternoon while reviewing corporate projections on his tablet. Sarah. She knelt inside the greenhouse, sleeves rolled above her elbows, hair escaping her loose braid as she worked the soil with intense concentration. He zoomed the security camera slightly. Not enough to intrude. Just enough to observe. She smiled occasionally while working, genuine, unguarded smiles that didn't belong inside Blackwood Manor's suffocating atmosphere. A strange sensation spread across his chest. Warm, unsettling and dangerously unfamiliar. He shut off the monitor abruptly. Yet later that evening, he found himself returning to it. And again the next day. And the day after that. The flowers continued. Daffodils appeared one morning, bright yellow against porcelain. Then small wild violets. Then pale roses with fragile petals. Alistair never acknowledged them. But he never removed them. The staff noticed. Mrs. Gable noticed most of all. She said nothing, though her sharp eyes lingered thoughtfully on Sarah whenever she passed through the halls. 2 weeks after their first confrontation, Sarah returned to the library during her afternoon cleaning rotation. The room felt less oppressive now. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting fractured jewel tones across bookshelves. She rolled the tall ladder along the shelves, searching for dust accumulating near the ceiling edges. She stretched upward, standing precariously on tiptoes as she reached for a leather-bound volume near the highest shelf. Her fingers barely grazed the book's spine. Suddenly, a tall shadow fell across her. A hand reached past her shoulder effortlessly and pulled the book free. Sarah gasped, her body jerking backward in surprise. The ladder wheels shifted slightly beneath her weight, wobbling dangerously. Strong arms gripped the ladder rails instantly, steadying it. She turned sharply. Alistair stood inches away. Closer than they had ever been. His hand still held the book loosely. His other arm braced the ladder beside her, effectively trapping her in the narrow space between metal rails and his towering frame. "You were about to fall," he said quietly. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it. I had it, she stammered, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her nerves. He handed her the book. Sonnets from the Portuguese, she read aloud softly, recognition lighting her eyes. Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He stiffened slightly. It belongs here, he said. I know, she replied quickly. It's just, my grandmother loves this collection. I read poetry to her over the phone sometimes. He watched her carefully as she ran her fingers gently along the worn book cover. How do you know it belonged to my mother? He asked suddenly. Sarah blinked, startled by the question. She wrote her name inside, she said gently. Eleanora Blackstone. Alistair inhaled sharply. Sarah continued softly, unaware of how deeply she was stepping into forbidden territory. The spine is worn near certain pages. That usually means someone read those poems repeatedly. Books hold emotional fingerprints if you pay attention. He stared at her. No one had ever spoken about his mother inside this house in 15 years. Not once. You speak as if objects have feelings, he said quietly. I think they hold memories, she replied. Their eyes locked. The space between them suddenly felt dangerously small. He noticed faint freckles dusting across her nose. The subtle citrus scent clinging to her skin from kitchen lemon soap. The way her breath quickened under his gaze. For a brief, reckless moment, he wondered what it would feel like to touch her face. The thought horrified him. He stepped back abruptly. This library is not a lending facility, he said coldly, though his voice lacked its usual sharp edge. Of course, she replied, smiling softly. I'll return it after reading to her. He turned quickly and walked away. But he didn't miss the way her warmth lingered in the air behind him. Back in his private wing, Alistair paced restlessly across his study. His mind replayed the encounter repeatedly. Her scent. Her voice. Her fearlessness when speaking about memories. He poured whiskey again. Left it untouched again. His carefully constructed emotional fortress felt unstable. Meanwhile, Sarah sat inside her quarters later that night, holding the poetry book carefully while speaking to her grandmother over the phone. Her voice softened as she read aloud. And miles away inside the West Wing, Alistair paused mid-step while passing through the hallway outside her door. He couldn't hear the words clearly. But he heard the warmth in her tone. He stood there longer than he should have. Then quietly walked away. Weeks passed. The greenhouse began changing dramatically under Sarah's quiet dedication. Glass panels were replaced using leftover estate materials. New flower beds flourished with vibrant color. Hanging ivy cascaded elegantly from restored rafters. It slowly transformed into a sanctuary of living color against the manor's cold stone exterior. One afternoon, Alistair found himself walking toward it without fully remembering deciding to go there. He stopped outside the doorway, watching Sarah carefully transplant seedlings while humming softly. Sunlight streamed through glass panels, surrounding her in golden warmth. She looked alive. And for the first time in years, he felt painfully aware of how lifeless he had allowed himself to become. He stepped away before she could notice him. But something inside him had shifted permanently. Later that evening, Mrs. Gable approached Alistair during dinner service. Miss Macquez has been restoring the greenhouse, she stated neutrally. I am aware, he replied without looking up. She uses her personal time. No estate resources. Silence stretched between them. You have not ordered her to stop, Mrs. Gable added carefully. Alistair placed his fork down slowly. No, he said simply. Mrs. Gable nodded once and left the room, her expression carrying the faintest trace of approval. That night, Alistair returned to the observatory during a light coastal rainstorm. Lightning flashed across distant waves. He leaned against the glass dome, staring at the glowing greenhouse below where soft lantern light illuminated Sarah's silhouette as she watered plants. His chest tightened painfully. He didn't understand the emotion building inside him. Hope. Fear. Desire. All tangled into something dangerously human. And the more he tried to suppress it, the stronger it became. The storm arrived without warning. Black clouds rolled over the ocean like a living creature crawling toward Blackwood Manor. The wind howled against the cliffs, bending ancient trees until their branches scraped violently against stone walls. Inside the manor, chandeliers trembled as thunder cracked overhead. Sarah had just finished organizing the pantry when the lights flickered once, twice. Then everything went black. The sudden silence was deafening. The constant electrical hum that normally filled the massive estate vanished instantly, replaced by the raw sounds of the storm clawing at the building. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Mrs. Gable shouting instructions to the maintenance staff. "The generators should be activated by now," someone yelled. Sarah grabbed a brass candelabra from the kitchen storage cabinet, striking a match with steady hands. Golden candlelight flared, casting dancing shadows across marble countertops. Despite the chaos around her, she felt strangely calm. Storms had always comforted her as a child. Her grandmother used to say thunder was simply the sky arguing with itself before learning to forgive. Balancing the candelabra carefully, Sarah stepped into the corridor. Meanwhile, inside the West Wing, Alistair stood frozen in complete darkness. He wasn't afraid of storms. He wasn't afraid of darkness. But he hated unpredictability. He hated losing control. The generators had never failed before. The manor was designed to function flawlessly, like every other aspect of his isolated world. His breathing grew shallow as thunder rattled the windows. Old memories stirred violently beneath the surface. The last time chaos had overtaken his life. Everything had been destroyed. He clenched his jaw and stepped into the hallway, navigating purely from memory. Then he saw light approaching. Soft golden light swaying through darkness like a fragile star. Sarah appeared at the far end of the corridor, the candle flames illuminating her face in warm amber glow. Her expression held concern, but no panic. "Mrs. Gable is organizing emergency lighting downstairs," she said gently as she approached. "Maintenance is working on the generators." "I am aware," he replied stiffly. She studied him for a moment longer than necessary. "You don't like storms," she observed quietly. "I dislike mechanical failures," he corrected sharply. She nodded thoughtfully, accepting the deflection without challenging it. "The observatory probably has the best view of the lightning," she said softly. "It's kind of beautiful tonight." He stared at her, suspicious of the invitation beneath her casual tone. Yet something in him was too exhausted to refuse. Without speaking, he turned toward the spiral staircase leading upward. After a brief hesitation, she followed. The circular observatory dome sat at the highest point of Blackwood Manor, surrounded by curved glass panels offering uninterrupted views of the ocean and sky. Without electricity, the room was illuminated only by candlelight and flashes of violent lightning tearing across the horizon. Rain hammered against the glass like thousands of desperate fingers. Sarah placed the candelabra on a nearby table, the warm glow softening the room's sharp architectural edges. For several moments, they stood side by side, watching the storm rage across the sea below. Lightning forked through clouds, illuminating monstrous waves crashing against jagged cliffs. "It's breathtaking," Sarah whispered. "It's destructive," Alistair replied. She glanced at him sideways. "Sometimes those are the same thing." He said nothing. The silence stretched, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. The storm seemed to speak for them both. "My father used to bring me here during storms," Alistair said suddenly. The word surprised both of them. He stared straight ahead, as though speaking directly to the lightning instead of her. "He believed chaos revealed truth," he continued quietly. "He said you learned more about a structure when you saw what parts broke under pressure." Sarah listened silently, sensing how fragile this moment was. He taught me constellations here, Alistair said, his voice lowering. Told me the stars were permanent. A map humanity could always trust, even when everything else changed. A bitter smile ghosted across his lips. He was wrong. Sarah turned toward him slowly. What happened? The question hovered dangerously between them. For years, Alistair had buried this story beneath layers of corporate achievements and emotional barricades. Yet tonight, beneath thunder and candlelight, words began escaping. My father partnered with another technology firm 30 years ago, he said carefully. A man he considered family. They built innovations that would have reshaped the global market. They trusted each other completely. Another lightning strike illuminated his expression, grief carved deep into sharp features. The partnership collapsed overnight. Corporate espionage. Financial sabotage. Investors fled. My father lost everything, including his reputation. He paused, swallowing hard. My parents died 6 months later in what authorities called an accident. Their car lost control on a coastal highway during a storm much like this one. Sarah's breath caught. But you don't believe it was an accident, she said softly. I believe betrayal poisons everything it touches, he replied. His hands clenched tightly behind his back. They trusted the wrong people. And it destroyed them. Sarah hesitated before stepping slightly closer to him. I'm sorry, she said gently. He laughed bitterly. Sympathy from strangers has never impressed me. I'm not offering sympathy, she replied. I'm offering understanding. He turned sharply toward her, eyes blazing with confusion and anger. You cannot possibly understand. My grandfather trusted someone who destroyed his business too, she said quietly. The confession slipped out before she could stop it. She wasn't lying. But she didn't know the full truth yet. He lost everything, she continued. His pride. His health. He spent the rest of his life believing he had failed our family. Alistair studied her intensely. And you still believe people are worth trusting? He asked. Yes, she answered without hesitation. Why? Because without trust, we're just surviving. Not living. The simplicity of her answer struck him harder than any elaborate philosophy ever had. Lightning flashed again, plunging the observatory into blinding white light before fading back into candlelit shadows. Sarah stood closer than she realized. Close enough for him to see every delicate detail of her face. Close enough to hear her breathing. A surge of emotion rose inside him, fierce, overwhelming, terrifying. Before he could rationalize it, his hand lifted slowly toward her cheek. Sarah's breath hitched. Her eyes softened, uncertain but not retreating. The world outside roared violently, but inside the observatory, time seemed suspended between heartbeats. His fingers hovered inches from her skin. He imagined the warmth of her touch. The softness. The possibility of comfort he had denied himself for years. Then fear crashed through him like the storm outside. If he touched her, he might need her. And needing someone had once destroyed everything he loved. His hand dropped abruptly. He stepped back. The moment shattered like fragile glass. Sarah didn't move. She understood rejection when she saw it. But this didn't feel like rejection. It felt like fear. You should return downstairs, he said quietly, regaining his composure. The staff will need assistance. Yes, Mr. Blackstone, she replied softly. But before leaving, she added gently. You're allowed to remember them without punishing yourself. He didn't respond. She carried the candelabra toward the staircase, leaving him alone beneath the storm-lit glass dome. Hours later, electricity returned to Blackwood Manor. The storm gradually weakened, leaving behind only distant thunder and steady rainfall. But something far more significant had shifted inside both of them. Alistair remained in the observatory long after Sarah left. Her words echoed relentlessly inside his mind. You're allowed to remember them without punishing yourself. He had built his entire existence around punishment. Isolation. Control. Emotional detachment. And yet one woman had dismantled pieces of that fortress in a single night. He pressed his palm against the glass dome, staring down toward the greenhouse glowing faintly under emergency lighting. Hope felt dangerously close. And he hated how much he wanted it. Inside her quarters, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the observatory moment repeatedly in her mind. His vulnerability. His grief. The way his hand had almost touched her. Her heart ached with a mixture of tenderness and confusion. She had taken this job out of desperation. But somewhere between dusty hallways and fragile flowers, she had fallen into something far more complicated. The following morning, Mrs. Gable observed both of them carefully during routine operations. Alistair lingered slightly longer during breakfast service. Sarah moved through the halls with distracted thoughts and flushed cheeks. Mrs. Gable said nothing. But deep inside, she recognized something she had not witnessed since Alistair's parents were alive. Hope. The storm had passed. The manor stood exactly as it had before. Stone walls. Endless corridors. Ancient silence. Yet beneath its rigid structure, something fragile had begun to bloom. Two wounded souls had glimpsed each other in the darkness. And neither of them would ever be able to pretend they were alone again. In the weeks that followed, a fragile peace settled over the manor. Alistair remained reclusive, but his solitude had softened. He'd occasionally appear in the library while Sarah was working, sitting in silence, a silence that now felt companionable rather than tense. This new proximity only fueled Sarah's gentle curiosity. She wanted to understand the sadness that clung to the house, which led her to the one place that was strictly forbidden, the West Wing. One afternoon, Alistair did something unheard of. He called Sarah to his study. He was leaving for a rare video conference and needed a specific file from the archives room connected to his study, a room she'd never been in. He was actually trusting her, even if he wouldn't say it. While searching for the file, her arm brushed a stack of old ledgers, and they tumbled to the floor. Mortified, Sarah knelt to gather them. As she picked one up, it fell open. The pages detailed financial transactions from 30 years ago. A single paragraph, circled in angry red ink, caught her eye. It described the catastrophic collapse of a partnership, a deal gone wrong. And then she saw the names. Alistair Blackstone Sr. and his partner, the man the ledger accused of corporate espionage, the man whose betrayal, the notes claimed, led to the deaths of both of Alistair's parents. The name was Theodore Macquez. Sarah's blood ran cold. Theodore Macquez. Her grandfather. The world tilted. The fragmented stories of her childhood, her family's sudden poverty, her grandfather's broken spirit, it all snapped into a horrifyingly clear picture. It wasn't a bad deal. It was this. This house, this man's pain, it was all born from a secret her own family had buried. She was the granddaughter of the man who had destroyed the Blackstones. At that same moment, Alistair was ending his meeting. But his mind was elsewhere. The ease with which Sarah had slipped into his life felt like more than a coincidence. The employment agency that sent her was new, with no history. It was a loose thread, and Alistair didn't tolerate loose threads. He'd had his head of security run a full background check on her. He told himself it was just a precaution. But really, he was afraid of what he would find. An email pinged. He opened the file. Her life was laid out in cold, hard facts. And there, in her family tree, was her grandfather, Theodore Macquez. The room went silent. A white-hot rage, cold and pure, washed over him. The flowers. The smiles. The storm. It was all a lie. A calculated, 30-year-long game of revenge, and he had walked right into the trap. She was a Macquez. She hadn't stumbled into his life to bring him light, she'd been sent to put out what little he had left. He rose from his chair, a powerful calm settling over him. Every tender moment twisted into an act of betrayal. He strode out of his office, his footsteps echoing like a death knell, making a direct line for the archives. He was going to find her. And he was going to tear her world apart, just as her family had done to his. Alistair threw open the archive doors with such force they slammed against the walls. Sarah scrambled to her feet, the ledger clutched in her hands, her face pale and stained with tears. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette of pure fury. The vulnerability she had seen was gone, replaced by an arctic coldness that was more terrifying than any shouting. "So, the little mouse finally found the cheese," he said, his voice a low, deadly monotone. "Tell me, was this part of the plan? To accidentally find this and fake being shocked?" "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "Alistair, I swear, I didn't know." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Don't you dare use my name. Not now. How long have you been planning this? Was it all a lie? The cheerful humming? The flowers? Bringing my mother's greenhouse back to life? Was it all just a performance to see what else you could take? To finish what your grandfather started?" His words were like daggers. "My grandfather," she choked out. "He was a broken man. He died with nothing, ashamed of a past I never understood. Our family has struggled for 30 years because of what happened. There was no plan. There was no revenge. There was only a girl desperate for a job so she could pay for her grandmother's medicine." She held the ledger out to him, a desperate offering. "I found this 5 minutes ago. I swear." But Alistair was beyond reason, drowning in a decade of grief. Her pleas were just more lies. He saw the face of his enemy. "Get out," he hissed, his voice dropping to a frigid whisper. "Get out of my house." "Alistair, please," she begged, tears flowing freely. "You have to believe me." "Believe you?" he snarled, his control finally snapping. He snatched the ledger from her hand and threw it across the room. "Believe a Macquez? I would sooner believe the sun would rise in the west. You are the daughter of a thief and a liar, and that is all you will ever be." The cruelty in his voice was absolute. She saw then that it was useless. The wall around his heart wasn't just made of ice, it was forged from years of pain, and she had just become the new face of that pain. "I want you gone by morning," he commanded, turning his back on her. "If you ever breathe a word of what you have learned here, I will use every resource I have to ensure you and your pathetic family are ruined. Now, get out of my sight." Numbly, Sarah turned and walked out, leaving him alone in the wreckage of his study, and in the ruins of the one beautiful thing he had let himself have. The silence that fell over Blackwood Manor after Sarah left wasn't peaceful. It was a dead, hollow, suffocating void. The house that had held its breath when she was there now seemed to have died with her absence. Alistair stalked the halls like a caged animal. He ordered the greenhouse locked and every flower removed. He tried to restore his old routine, his perfect isolation, but the foundations were cracked. He'd walk into the library and expect to see her on the ladder. He'd sit for breakfast and automatically search for the splash of color that was no longer there. He had his wish. He was alone. And he had never been more miserable. 2 days later, Mrs. Gable found him in his study, staring at a cold cup of coffee. She had served the Blackstone family for 50 years. Her professional silence, a lifetime of it, finally broke. She placed a fresh cup on his desk. "You are a fool, Mr. Alistair." His head snapped up, eyes flashing. "You are overstepping, Gable." "Perhaps," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "But I knew your mother and father. They were good people who were dealt a terrible hand. But they never once allowed bitterness to poison their souls. They would be ashamed of what you have become. And heartbroken by what you've done." "You know nothing," he growled. I know I saw that girl's heart, Mrs. Gable pressed on. I saw the way she looked at the beauty in this house that everyone else overlooked. I saw the way she looked at the broken man hiding inside it. She brought more light into these halls in 2 months than I have seen in 20 years. And you threw it away because of a name. She placed a small, worn object on the desk. She left this. It fell out of her book. It was a faded photograph of a young, gap-toothed Sarah, her arms wrapped around her grandmother. On the back, in pencil, was a list of loan payments. Small amounts, meticulously tracked. This wasn't the work of a grand conspirator. This was the life of a girl just trying to keep her family afloat. Alistair stared at the photo. The cold certainty he'd wrapped himself in began to crumble. He had been so sure, so righteous. He had seen a ghost from the past and had been completely blind to the real woman in front of him. He hadn't punished an enemy. He had punished an innocent woman for the sins of her grandfather. And in doing so, he had destroyed his own chance at happiness. That photograph was a mirror, and in it, Alistair saw himself not as a powerful billionaire or a tragic hero, but as a coward. He was a man so terrified of being hurt again that he had preemptively destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to him. He had finally become the monster everyone whispered about. The weight of his actions crashed down on him. The hollow ache in his chest was no longer the old wound of his parents' betrayal, it was a new, raw, gaping wound of his own making. The loss of Sarah. He looked around his opulent study at the priceless artifacts. It was all just cold, lifeless stuff. He had protected his gilded cage, but in doing so, had locked out the only person who had ever made him feel like it could be a home. He knew what he had to do. The thought was terrifying. It meant leaving the safety of his walls. It meant being vulnerable. It meant facing the woman he had so cruelly wounded and begging for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. For the first time in 10 years, Alistair Blackstone walked to the grand front entrance of his manor, not to pace, but to leave. He pulled open the heavy oak doors himself, letting the bright morning sun stream in. He stepped outside, into the fresh air. He didn't know where she was. He didn't know if she would ever speak to him again. But as he got into his car and drove through the iron gates, leaving Blackwood Manor in his rearview mirror, he knew he had to try. In the end, Alistair Blackstone learned that a house is just a building, and a fortune is just paper. The real prison was the one he built in his own heart, and the only key was forgiveness. But will he find Sarah? Can a love born from such a dark secret ever truly heal? If you want to find out what happens next, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. The story of Alistair and Sarah is a reminder that the ghosts of the past are only as powerful as we allow them to be. Forgiveness is a difficult path, and trust, once shattered, is the hardest thing to rebuild. But sometimes, the hope of a future is the only thing strong enough to inspire the courage to face the past. Whether Alistair will be brave enough to earn that future, and whether Sarah will be there to let him in, is a story for another time.